Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are we're standing on the precipice of one of the most chaotic, transformative, and, well, frankly, dramatic periods in human history.
It really is, yeah.
We're looking at a stack of sources that, they paint a picture of a world that is effectively ending and restarting at the same time.
A total reset.
It's a time when the map was being redrawn in blood and the old rules of civilization had completely evaporated.
It really is a scene of absolute upheaval. If you look at the primary descriptions in the text, you get this sense of vertigo. Everything people thought was permanent, the roads, the laws, the safety was suddenly just gone.
Exactly. The source material opens with this incredibly stark, almost cinematic contrast. It says, empires fell, kings rose. And I want to pause on that for a second because it sounds so poetic, but the reality described here is it's terrifying. We aren't just talking about a change in management.
Not at all.
We are talking about the collapse of the infrastructure of daily life.
That's the critical context, right? When the text says empires fell, it means the central nervous system of the continent just shut down.
The nervous system, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, there was no police force. There was no standing army to protect the borders anymore. The trade routes that brought grain and oil across the world were cut.
Right.
So you have this massive vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum, but so does politics.
Exactly. And into that vacuum step these new figures.
Yeah.
Kings rose, the text says.
But these aren't the polished monarchs we see in, Renaissance paintings, are they?
Oh, hardly. No. These are warlords. They're the guys with the biggest swords and the most loyal gangs of fighters.
Right.
They were carving out little fiefdoms in the mud. It was a fractured world. The text describes Europe as fracturing into separate kingdoms, which is, a very polite way of saying it was a complete free-for-all.
So you have this backdrop of total instability. Borders are moving every week. Leaders are being toppled constantly. It's basically anarchy.
It is.
But then the source material pivots. It introduces the central protagonist of our deep dive today. It says, amidst all that falling and rising and fracturing, one institution remained.
The church.
And that's the hook. That is the mystery we're trying to solve today. How does an institution that is, technically about the soul, about faith, the afterlife, the intangible, how does it manage to become the only solid rock in a landslide?
Yeah.
And not just survive, but as the text describes it, become the most powerful force on the continent?
That is the mission.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we have to unpack here. The mechanics of that survival. Because it wasn't a miracle, it was a structural triumph.
Structural.
Yeah. We're going to look at how an institution of faith evolved into a political juggernaut. We're talking about the tension between spiritual authority, dealing with sins and salvation, and earthly authority, dealing with taxes, armies, and land.
And the text highlights a very specific duality in its legacy, right? It talks about hope and fear.
Which puts us right in the middle of the ultimate power struggle. This isn't just about religion. It's about the crown versus the altar. It's about how, and this is a key phrase, faith-shaped law.
Faith-shaped law.
It is fundamentally a story about the architecture of power itself.
I love that phrase, the architecture of power. So let's start at the foundation then, the survivor. The text makes a big deal about the fact that while empires crumbled, the church remained. Why? What did the church have that the Roman Empire or, these new warlords didn't?
Well, in a word, it had the network.
That word.
Think about it. When the political borders shattered, the Roman roads fell into disrepair, and the legions went home, the network of bishops, priests, and monasteries, it stayed exactly where it was.
So it was pre-installed infrastructure.
Exactly. It was the only organization that transcended the new borders. If you were a peasant in what is now France, or a merchant in Italy, or a noble in, say, Germany, everything about your life was different. Different laws, different languages, different kings.
Right, total chaos.
But the church was the universal constant. The Mass was the same. The calendar was the same. The hierarchy was the same. The language of the church, Latin, was the same.
So while the political map is shattering like a dropped mirror, the spiritual map, it just stays intact.
Perfectly intact. It was the glue holding the very concept of Europe together. In fact, for a long time, people didn't really think of themselves as French or German. That's a later idea. They thought of themselves as part of Christendom.
A shared identity.
The only shared identity. The church provided something that no king could offer.
That makes so much sense. It's the baseline stability. But the text suggests the church wasn't content just being the glue. It started taking on these active roles. It lists 3 distinct titles that the church assumed: kingmaker, consultant, and the voice.
These are fascinating because they show the progression from, spiritual leadership to absolute political necessity. Let's start with Kingmaker.
Okay, Kingmaker. The text says the church crowned rulers. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a nice ceremony, a photo op for the Dark Ages. But you're nodding like it's way, way more than that.
Oh, it's everything. It is everything. In a world of warlords, legitimacy is the most valuable currency there is.
More than gold or armies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you seize a throne just because you killed the last guy, you have to sleep with one eye open because the next guy is coming to kill you. You have might, but you don't have right.
You're just a thug with a crown.
Precisely. You're a gangster. But if the representative of the Almighty on earth places that crown on your head, suddenly you aren't just a warlord. You are the anointed. You're chosen by God to rule. The church had the power to turn force into authority.
That is a massive service to provide. It's like a cosmic seal of approval.
And it wasn't free. That's the key here. It was never free. If I have the power to make you a legitimate king, I also have the implied power to say you aren't a legitimate king.
So the threat is always there.
The kingmaker is always more powerful than the king. That's the leverage.
Wow. Okay, so that's Kingmaker. Let's look at the second role, consultant.
Oh.
The text says the church advised emperors.
This one comes down to a monopoly on a specific technology.
A technology.
Literacy.
Right, of course. We forget that for centuries, reading and writing were incredibly rare skills, even for the nobility.
Especially for the nobility. The warlords were busy fighting. They were training with swords from the age of 7. They didn't have time to learn Latin grammar.
But you can't run a kingdom with just a sword.
No. Running a kingdom requires administration. You need to write laws, keep tax records, send diplomatic letters to the guy next door, asking him not to invade. Who does that?
The clergy.
The clergy. They were the educated class, the civil service. So you have this dynamic where the king is sitting on the throne, all powerful, but the guy standing behind him, reading the mail, writing the decrees, and interpreting the laws is a bishop or a priest.
That puts them in the room where it happens.
It puts them controlling the room. I mean, think about it. If you filter the information the king receives and you draft the orders the king signs, you are shaping policy at the most fundamental level.
They weren't just spiritual advisors.
No, they were the chief of staff, the secretary of state, and the attorney general, all rolled into one guy wearing robes.
Which leads perfectly to the third role, the voice. The text says the church spoke with moral authority.
And moral authority sounds soft to our modern ears, doesn't it? It sounds optional.
Yeah, like an opinion piece.
But in this context, it was absolute. We have to remember that this society was deeply, profoundly religious in a way that is, frankly, hard for us to imagine. They believed, literally, in the immediate reality of heaven and hell.
It wasn't an abstract concept.
It was as real as the dirt under their feet. So the institution that controlled the definitions of right and wrong controlled the behavior of the entire population.
And this connects directly to that section in our source that says faith-shaped law and doctrine-shaped society.
Yes. This is such a crucial distinction. Today, we have secular law. You don't rob a bank because it's illegal, and you'll go to jail.
Simple cause and effect.
In the world of our text, you don't rob a bank, or, its equivalent, because it is a sin, and you will burn for eternity. The legal code wasn't separate from the religious code. It was derived from it.
So faith-shaped law means the 10 Commandments weren't just suggestions, they were the statutes.
Exactly. And doctrine-shaped society means the church set the rhythm of human life from birth to death. Think about it. When do you rest? On the church's holy days. Who decides if your marriage is valid? The church.
Who handles your will when you die?
The church. Who decides if you can charge interest on a loan? The church says that's usury, so no, it was.
It's the operating system of reality.
That's the perfect analogy. It was the OS. You couldn't run any other software. You couldn't just opt out of the church's influence because there was no secular space to move into. There was nowhere else to go.
I want to talk about the visuals here for a moment because the text includes this beautiful, haunting line. Cathedrals reached toward the heavens while power was negotiated on earth.
It creates such a vivid spatial contrast, doesn't it? The vertical versus the horizontal.
It really does. I'm picturing these massive stone Gothic structures. And, we have to remember the scale. In a town where most people lived in single-story wooden huts with thatched roofs, a cathedral would have looked like an alien spaceship had landed.
It would have been completely overwhelming. The sheer engineering, the height, the stone, the stained glass, it was a physical manifestation of the hierarchy.
So steep.
A huge one. The cathedral dominates the landscape, just as the church dominated the culture. It points upward, forcing your eyes to look at the sky, symbolizing the spiritual aspiration.
Reaching toward the heavens.
Right. It says the important stuff is up there. This life is just a waiting room for the next one.
But then the text hits us with that reality check. Power was negotiated on earth.
And that's the friction. That's the rub. Because those cathedrals didn't just fall out of the sky, they were expensive.
Incredibly expensive.
To build them, the church needed money, land, and labor. And to get those things, they had to deal with the kings, the warlords, the merchants. They had to tax, they had to trade, they had to cut deals, they had to get their hands dirty.
It's the difference between the ideal and the hustle.
Precisely. The spire is the ideal. The foundation is the hustle. And the source sets this up to show us the inherent conflict. You have an institution that claims to be about the next world, but to function, it has to be the master of this one.
And when you are the master of this world, you eventually run into other people who think they are the masters.
And that's the collision course.
Which brings us to the main event, the title fight. The text poses the big question: who held ultimate authority?
And notice the answer it gives. The answer was never simple.
I love that honesty in the text, because logically it should be simple, right? The Pope handles souls, the king handles bodies. Stay in your lane.
But the lanes were completely merged. That's the problem. There was no line. This is the central conflict of the Middle Ages.
So what were the competing claims?
Well, the popes claimed spiritual supremacy. Their argument was, basically, since the soul is eternal and the body is temporary, the caretaker of the soul is obviously superior to the caretaker of the body.
It's a hierarchy of value. My domain is more important than your domain.
Exactly. The classic metaphor was the pope is the sun and the king is the moon. The moon only shines because the sun reflects off it.
I'm guessing the kings, they had a slightly different opinion on the matter.
Just a bit. The kings claimed political control. Their argument was, look, I am the one with the sword. I am the one protecting the borders from invasion. I am God's anointed deputy on earth to keep order and punish evil.
So you have two absolute claims to power over the same people in the same place.
And that friction sparked centuries of drama. The text says sometimes they cooperated. And we've seen why the king needs the coronation, the church needs the protection and the money. When it worked, it was a symbiotic machine.
But then, sometimes they collided.
And when they collided, it shook the continent. I mean, we're talking about moments where the entire legal and social order of a country could grind to a halt because the king and the pope were in a staring contest.
So what were their weapons? The text breaks down the mechanisms of this control. It calls them the stick and the carrot. Let's talk about the stick first. Excommunications humbled rulers.
This is a concept that is really, really hard for modern minds to fully grasp. We tend to think of excommunication as being kicked out of a club. You lose your membership card.
Right. It sounds social, maybe a bit embarrassing, but the text implies it was weaponized.
It was a political nuclear bomb. In a society where doctrine shaped society, as we established, being excommunicated meant you were cut off from the body of Christ. No sacraments, no confession, no last rites if you die.
So you're damned.
You were effectively damned while you were still alive.
That's terrifying for an individual. But how does that humble a ruler? I mean, if I'm a king, why do I care? I've still got an army.
You care because your power depends on oaths of loyalty. The entire feudal system was a pyramid of promises. Your barons swear an oath to you. Their knights swear an oath to them. It's all built on these sacred vows.
Okay, a web of oaths.
But if the church excommunicates the king, they can also release all of his subjects from their oaths of fealty.
Oh, wow. So the Pope can basically just say, this man is no longer a Christian king, so you don't have to listen to him anymore.
Exactly. It's a kill switch for loyalty. It legitimized rebellion. It gave every rival duke, every ambitious brother, and every unhappy peasant a divine permission slip to overthrow you.
So your own nobles could just turn on you.
And they would be doing God's work by doing it. We have these incredible historical accounts of emperors, specifically Henry IV, crossing the Alps in the dead of winter, standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside the Pope's castle, begging for forgiveness.
Barefoot in the snow. An emperor.
Barefoot in the snow. That is the power of the stick. A spiritual decree that could bring the most powerful man on earth to his knees because it stripped away his entire political foundation.
That is just wild. And then on the other side, you have the carrot. Coronations legitimized power.
This is the flip side of the coin. If the church could destroy a king with a word, it could also make a king with a ceremony. A coronation wasn't just a party. It was the moment the political control was sanctified by the spiritual authority.
It's the seal of approval we talked about earlier.
It's the ultimate seal. It says the structure of the universe supports this man's claim to power. So you see the dynamic. The king has the sword, but the church decides if the hand holding the sword is righteous.
They're trapped.
They're trapped. They hated the dependency, but they absolutely couldn't rule without it.
It's a delicate, maybe even a toxic balance, but the source material suggests that this balance shifted over time. It says there was a transformation. The church was no longer only a spiritual guide, it was a political force.
That phrasing is so key. Political force. It implies agency, action. The church stopped being just the referee of the game and started fielding its own team.
What does that mean in practice?
It means it became a state in its own right, with its own territories, the papal states, its own treasury, which was vast, and its own foreign policy and interests.
And the text gets really intense here. It starts using military language. Crusades were called. Borders were crossed.
This is the militarization of faith. This is a huge turning point. When we talk about crusades were called, we aren't just talking about a pilgrimage with weapons. We were talking about the Pope demonstrating that he could mobilize the armies of Europe better than any emperor could.
It's a geopolitical flex, a show of force.
A massive one. It showed that the allegiance to the church, to Christendom, superseded the allegiance to your local king. If the Pope says go east and fight, the knights go east, even if their king wants them to stay home and, fight his neighbor.
And the line borders were crossed. I read that in two ways. Obviously, the physical borders, armies moving from Europe to the Middle East.
Right, the projection of power across the known world.
But also metaphorical borders. A moral line was crossed, wasn't it?
Yes, that is the deeper, more troubling meaning. The line between the spiritual realm and the violent realm of statecraft. When the text says faith marched alongside armies, it's describing a hybridization, a fusion. You have the cross and the sword marching in lockstep.
It must have changed the nature of the institution itself.
Fundamentally, when you are commanding armies, you are no longer just a voice of morality. You are a combatant. You are a general. You're dealing with logistics, with bloodshed, with the spoils of war. You are deciding who lives and who dies, not just spiritually, but physically, on a battlefield.
And the text captures the duality of this perfectly. It says, for many, the church represented hope. We can't lose sight of that side of it.
We absolutely can't. If we only look at the popes and the emperors, we miss the human story. For the average person, the peasant working the fields, the widow, the orphan, the church was the only source of hope.
Yeah.
Well, it ran the hospitals, or what passed for them. It distributed charity. It provided the only education available to anyone. It was a social safety net.
The only safety net.
Yes, it was the sanctuary. In a violent, brutal world, the church was often the only place where you couldn't be attacked. The concept of sanctuary meant that if you got inside the church doors, the king's soldiers couldn't touch you. That is a powerful, powerful symbol of hope.
But then the text flips the coin. For others, fear.
And that is the cost of being a political force. If you are on the wrong side of that force, if you are a ruler who has been excommunicated, or a group deemed heretical, or just someone standing in the path of those marching armies, then the church represents absolute terror.
It's the Inquisition. It's the heresy trials. It's the burning at the stake.
It's all of that. It's the realization that this institution not only knows your thoughts through confession, but holds your eternal fate in its hands. When you combine ultimate spiritual authority with ultimate political power, you create a capacity for fear that no secular dictator can ever match.
Because a dictator can only kill your body.
A dictator can only kill your body. The church could tell you, with total authority, that you would burn forever.
That is a heavy, heavy duality, hope and fear wrapped up in the same institution. And this leads us to the section of the text that I think is the most profound. It's analyzing the cost of all this power. The text says, power protected the faith, but power also tested it.
That is the paradox at the heart of this entire deep dive. It is the central thesis of this whole story.
Okay, let's break that down piece by piece. Power protected the faith. The argument here is that without the swords, without the wealth, without playing the political game, the church would have just been crushed.
It's the pragmatic argument, isn't it? Look at the context we started with. Europe was a tank of sharks. Vikings, Magyars, warring feudal lords. Everyone was fighting everyone.
Total chaos.
If the church had just been a group of pacifist monks in the woods with no political leverage, no money, and no walls, they would have been wiped out. Or at the very least, they would have been marginalized to the point of total irrelevance.
So the armor was necessary for survival.
In a sense, yes. To survive in a world of wolves, the shepherd needed teeth. The political power, the land ownership, the alliances with kings, these were the walls that protected the faith and allowed it to spread and build those cathedrals.
Okay, that makes sense. But then comes the second half of that sentence, the really challenging part. But power also tested it.
And this is where the tragedy lies. This is the core of the problem. How do you hold ultimate authority without being corrupted by it? That's the test. And the text suggests the church, well, it struggled with this test mightily.
It mentions what happens in the shadows of influence. That sounds incredibly ominous.
It implies that behind the shiny coronations and the soaring cathedrals, there was a darker reality. When you become a political force, you have to play the political game. And the political game then, as now, is dirty.
You start making compromises, bending the rules.
You start making transactions. Simony, the selling of church offices, became a huge issue. Imagine if today you could buy a governorship or a judgeship just because you had the money. That happened with bishoprics. Rich families would buy these powerful positions for their sons, not because they were holy, but to secure land and influence.
So the spiritual role becomes just another financial asset, a piece of property.
Exactly. And when the priority shifts from saving souls to accumulating wealth and territory, the faith is being tested. You are engaging in the very worldly pursuits you are supposed to be transcending. The consultant starts thinking like the emperor he is advising.
And this brings us to the inevitable reaction, because people aren't stupid. The text ends with this incredibly evocative line, "Seeds of reform quietly grew."
I love that word quietly. It's so perfect. It suggests that while the church was at its loudest marching armies, crowning kings, building these massive stone structures, something else was happening underneath the surface, in the margins.
The shadows themselves were creating the conditions for change.
Exactly. The very things that made the church so powerful. The immense political force, the unimaginable wealth, the absolute authority were the very things that started to alienate people.
Because they can see the disconnect.
They can see the disconnect between the professed poverty of the apostles and the, obscene luxury of some of the bishops. They see the Prince of Peace being represented by armies sacking cities. That dissonance creates questions. And those questions, those are the seeds.
So the argument here is that the height of its power was also the beginning of its, well, not its downfall, but its transformation.
Yes. The seeds of reform didn't come from the barbarians outside the gates. They grew in the shadows of the institution's own influence. The cost of becoming a political force was that it invited scrutiny. It invited people to look at the gap between the spiritual guide it claimed to be and the political reality it had become.
It's a cycle, isn't it? Empires fell, kings rose, the church remained. But by remaining and becoming so powerful, it set the stage for the next big disruption.
That's the nature of history. It's almost a law of physics. No power is static. The moment you achieve ultimate authority, you create the friction that will eventually challenge that authority. The Reformation wasn't an accident. It was the pressure valve blowing off. After centuries of this tension building up and up and up.
It's really fascinating to just step back and look at that whole arc. We started with a Europe in pieces.
Completely fractured into kingdoms, just total chaos.
And we watched this one institution rise up to fill the gaps. It became the kingmaker, the voice, the judge.
It literally shaped the reality of the continent. Faith shaped law. It was the operating system for an entire civilization.
We saw it wrestle with kings, sometimes shaking hands, sometimes knocking heads, completely odd.
Using the keys to heaven to control the powers of earth. Excommunication versus coronation, the stick and the carrot.
And then we saw it put on armor. We saw the guide become a force with armies and borders.
And the inevitable costs of that transformation, that incredible duality of hope and fear, the corruption that grew in the shadows of its own power.
So let's bring this home. What does this all mean? Why does this specific deep dive matter to someone listening today?
I think it matters because it's a masterclass in the nature of institutions. We often think of history as just a list of dates and battles, but this text shows us it's really about the flow of power.
Right.
It's about the eternal trade-off between survival and purity. The church survived the fall of empires by becoming powerful, but that very power changed what the church was.
It gained the world.
And had to wrestle for its soul.
Exactly.
It shows us that you cannot separate an institution from the political reality it lives in. It doesn't matter if it's a government, a corporation, or a religious body. The accumulation of power always comes with a price tag. It always comes with a test.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave everyone with. The text gives us this perfect little formula. Power protected the faith. but power also tested it. And as a result, seeds of reform quietly grew.
Right. The whole cycle in 2 sentences.
So my question is this. If power protects faith, or any mission, any ideal, but also inevitably tests and corrupts it, is it actually possible for any institution to hold ultimate authority without, at the same time, creating the seeds of reform that will eventually dismantle it?
Wow.
Does the crown always come with the seeds of its own destruction?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Does absolute success inevitably trigger the reboot? History seems to suggest the answer is, more often than not, yes.
Something to mull over as you look at the powers in our own world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shadows of influence and the rise of the church.
It was a pleasure. A fascinating topic.
We'll see you next time.